Welcome back, everybody, to the second episode of the Coda Cappers College Football Computer Show. Dan Angel with me here. You can find him on Twitter, Dan Angel 11 on Twitter. I'm Coda Capper Pace. We're part of the Coda Sports Gambling Network. Of course, we're talking computer rankings. Dan does it every single week. He's been doing it for the last few years. If you missed kind of the introduction to the show, you can find the first episode link in the description, so you can check that out. It's about the first 10 minutes of the episode. You can just check out Dan. He kind of breaks it down and explains it. But Dan, real quick, just kind of go real quick, kind of briefly, what's the computer rankings all about, and what are we talking about here?
So basically, the computer ratings are a way to track how each team is doing relative to each other and give us a better idea of what might happen when two teams come up against each other, because we've got non-conference games and now conference games, and you're often tracking a bunch of unlike situations because one team will play a tough schedule, one team will play a lesser schedule. So the computer gives kind of a good estimate as to what each team's relative strength is. And when two teams come up against each other, it's a pretty good guide as to what is likely to happen on the field.
Yeah, for sure. The Big Ten last week, Dan, 7-0 straight up. Just thought that was pretty cool. The Pac-12, I know you can dive into these numbers a little more here. I just want to touch on these. The Pac-12, 5-1 straight up. And the SEC, I thought it was the most interesting one. 9-1 straight up, 3-7 against the spread.
Yeah, that one was rough because the SEC just had so many games against lesser schools, and teams like Georgia and Kentucky, MAC schools, and they just didn't do what was expected of them. So, I mean, Georgia, in fairness, it's tough when the computer has you favored by 60 points. There is a provision where if you're favored by 40 or more, the computer is a little bit more lenient as to not encourage running up the score. But Kentucky had no excuse. So they just let Northern Illinois hang around, and Northern Illinois is a solid MAC team, and they're probably going to be right in the thick of the MAC West race. But that's kind of a warning, as at least as far as I'm looking at it, on where Kentucky is, and maybe they're not as strong as I thought.
Yeah, for sure. Kentucky's got a big game here. I'm sure we'll touch on that. Overall, Dan, how did the computer do last week?
So the computer was really strong straight up, ended up going 45-13, wow. 28-30 against the spread, mainly because those SEC games were just a killer. The Pac-12 was by far the strongest. The computer closed the night with three really solid covers, including a perfect pick on Washington against Stanford, which was one of three perfect picks for the week. Washington, Georgia Southern, and North Dakota State were the three that did exactly what the computer expected them to do.
Yeah, for sure. So, Dan, you mentioned that 45-13 straight up, I think. Now, I know a lot of bettors, handicappers don't like to drink a lot of juice, right? But if you're going to win, maybe it's okay to put up $3 to a one, to win one.
Yeah. And I mean, one thing that I like doing with the computer is I'll use it as a guide for money line parlays. It's like combine 2 or 3 different options, or use it for a couple teasers. Like if the computer is saying, okay, this team is expected to win by 12 and Vegas has them at plus at minus 8.5, maybe I'll tease it a little bit, get a couple fewer points that I don't have to give, and come out ahead there.
Yeah, for sure. All right, well, let's start with the ACC here, Dan. One game I was interested in, I thought was interesting, the Florida State Seminoles minus 6.5 against Wake Forest. The computer has them, Florida State, by 3 over the Demon Deacons. So what do you like? What's the computer like here?
So the computer, I think, might be underrating Florida State a little bit because the way that the Seminoles schedule was structured, they got Louisville when Louisville was coming off that ugly loss to Syracuse, but Syracuse actually looks like they might be pretty good this year. So Louisville got punished for that game, but they probably shouldn't have been, but that doesn't help Florida State any. So I think this one might be one where the computer is underrating the Seminoles a little bit because as far as the computer knows, Florida State's only really been beating lesser teams. So this is one where I think what I would do is throw the Seminoles in a money line parlay or a teaser situation, probably tease that one down to minus 2.5 and pair it with somebody else that I think looks pretty solid, like maybe a Pittsburgh over Georgia Tech. and try and take advantage of it that way.
Yeah, for sure. I was just going to ask, would you tease Florida State or Wake Forest? But it sounds like you would tease Florida State.
Yeah, I think on the computer's getting a solid read on Wake, but I think Florida State is a little bit underrated. So that -6.5, I think, is probably right around where it should be. But with the computer saying 3, I think I'd rather get it down to like Florida State -2.5 and pair that with somebody else.
Yeah, for sure. Very nice. All right. Big 12. We got Oklahoma -6.5. The computer has Oklahoma winning by just one point, Dan, over TCU.
Yeah, so that one is kind of just what happens after Oklahoma plays Kansas State. I mean, for whatever reason, the Sooners just cannot figure out how to beat the Wildcats. And on top of that, the computer probably punished Oklahoma a little more than it should have, because Kansas State was coming off facing the ultimate wicker basket that is Tulane. So I just cannot figure out Tulane, and neither can the computer. So because of Tulane's schizophrenia, Kansas State's rating was a little lower than it should have been, and Oklahoma bore the brunt of that after losing to K-State. So their rating might be a little lower than it should be, and I think that might be another one to tease the Sooners, because I think they're probably going to bounce back after that tough loss to K-State.
Yeah, for sure. Dan, I know you talked about this in episode 1, but home field advantage, the computer doesn't really take that into account. Is that correct?
It does take it into account a little bit. So the computer will give an automatic 3 points to the home team. So like looking at this game specifically, so Oklahoma's current rating is, let me pull it up here, 43.89. So I always round up if it's over 0.5. So Oklahoma, the computer sees that as a 44. TCU, the computer sees that as a 40. So the game being in Fort Worth, that comes out to Oklahoma by 1 point.
Okay.
If it was in Norman, it'd be 3 points the other way, and Oklahoma would be getting 7. Yep. So when I enter the score in to make up for that, I add 3 points to the visitor's score for what the computer sees. So if Oklahoma wins this game 24-17, the computer will see Oklahoma 27, TCU 17.
Okay. Sounds good. Cool. I know a big game people are paying attention to are betting here in the Big 12, Iowa State and Kansas. Kansas kind of looks like a wagon right now. Iowa State -3. But the computer, Dan, has the Cyclones winning by 8 or more over the Jayhawks.
Yeah, I think the computer might be right on the money on this one, because Kansas, as well as the Jayhawks, have played. Iowa State is a terrible matchup for the Jayhawks, because a Lance Leipold team is going to be a run-heavy team. That's how he won so many games at Buffalo. That's how he's done well at Kansas. And nobody runs on Iowa State. Mm-hmm. The Cyclones' run defense is fantastic. So I think this is going to be a situation where Iowa State gets ahead. The Jayhawks should have a good home crowd, but I don't think they have the personnel needed to win this type of game. And I think they give it a good effort, but I think Iowa State comes out with a fairly comfortable win. And I like giving 3 there. I think that's going to be a solid play.
Yeah, for sure. I like that one too. Texas and West Virginia here, Dan. One of our guys is going to be in the house here for this contest. Texas -8.5, but the computer has Texas by 16 over West Virginia.
Yeah. So the computer really doesn't know what to do with West Virginia right now. I mean, West Virginia is suffering a little bit from Florida State disease as well, because West Virginia caught that loss to Kansas when the computer thought Kansas was still terrible from last year. So the Mountaineers got punished more than they should have been, now that it knows, okay, Kansas is actually a pretty good team this season. So that one might be a little bit inflated, especially because Texas, I mean, we've seen that Texas isn't back, and the Longhorns are getting an inflated rating from losing to Alabama as closely as they did. So I don't know. I think that one might be one that I either stay away from, or I tease West Virginia, because I'm just not confident at all in the Longhorns.
Yeah, for sure. Should be a good contest nonetheless. Big 10 here, like we mentioned, 7-0 straight up last week. You have Minnesota here. I'm obviously invested in this game, being kind of in the Midwest. Mm-hmm. I took Purdue as my upset of the week, but the computer does not agree with me here, Dan. Minnesota -10.5.
To be completely fair, the computer is working off Purdue minus Aiden O'Connell against Florida Atlantic.
Okay, that's
so
fair. Yep.
When and that is one of the flaws with the computer, is that it cannot adjust very well to a key player being out with an injury. So as far as it knows, Purdue played without Aiden O'Connell. The computer does not know if Aiden O'Connell is coming back and is assuming that he is not. So that's why that rating is as big a gap as it is. That's one that I would not trust unless it turns out that O'Connell is not going to play. If he is going to play, then that could be one where Minnesota's a little bit inflated. If he's not, then that 21 probably looks pretty good.
Yep, for sure. Like Dan just said, computer has Minnesota by 21 over the Boilermakers there. Another one here, Dan, an underdog winning. The computer has Indiana plus 5.5, taking down Nebraska by at least 5 points. What do you like here?
The sports books and the general public just cannot accept that Nebraska is just not that good of a team.
It's just wild.
To be completely fair, the computer did actually buy that notion of Nebraska being one of the best 3-9 teams ever last year, because Nebraska, even with that sad record, was still up in the 40s. Mm-hmm. This year they're down in the 20s, and Indiana has actually played pretty decently. And one thing that you cannot say about the Hoosiers, they're not going to quit. The Hoosiers, even though they have a lack of talent in several areas, Tom Allen gets that team to fight on every play. And you can't say that for Nebraska. Like, when I was on the cruise ship, I did catch a few highlights of college football games that Saturday. Nebraska's effort against Oklahoma was just appalling. Like, seeing some of those defensive players, like, the first thought I had from that game was, this team might not win another game the rest of the season. So I was hoping that line was going to get to 7 points so I could take Indiana as my upset of the week, but the computer's not bound by that same rule. So this is the computer's upset of the week, taking the Hoosiers against Nebraska. And the computer has pulled out upsets before in Lincoln when Troy won that game a couple years ago. That was really, looking back on it, the beginning of the end for Scott Frost. The computer was on the Trojans to win.
Nice. Look at that. All right. So again, if you don't believe the computer, I think that's a very good stat right there, Dan, you got to take that into account. So the computer does a good job. Pac-12 here, 5-1 straight up last week. UCLA plus 3.5, but the computer has the Bruins over Washington. Obviously, this is a home game for the Bruins here.
Yeah, and I think that's going to make the difference. I mean, Washington, it's tough to really say how good this team is because the computer is still figuring out what to do with Michigan State, because Michigan State is really what's making Washington look good. And based on what it's seen, the computer is operating under the assumption that Michigan State might suck. So UCLA, they haven't looked that impressive, but that South Alabama team that almost beat them, South Alabama is actually looking like a pretty solid Sun Belt Conference team. And one thing that the computer does not take into account at all is what conference you're in or any of your history other than the most recent history of last year. So the computer thinks that South Alabama team is pretty good, and that is not something that's punishing UCLA. And I don't think Washington's going to get the turnovers they need to win this game against the Bruins. So I like that plus 3.5 with UCLA, and they might win it outright.
There we go. Oregon, Dan, minus 15.5, but the computer has them by 22 over Stanford here.
Yeah, so the computer actually read Stanford perfectly last week, had them losing by 18 to Washington, and that was exactly what the Cardinal did. Oregon, so when you go into a game where the computer does not expect you to win and you do win it, the computer is going to reward you for that. And the one game that the computer got wrong straight up last week was Oregon-Washington State. The computer had Washington State winning that game by 3, and Oregon was the one who won by 3. So the computer's pretty high on the Ducks right now. It's brushing off that loss to Georgia as just Georgia being Georgia. So, yeah, it thinks that this is a pretty good play to make on the Ducks here.
Yeah, love it. Washington State probably should have won that game. Some
should have.
Yeah, some are saying. Dan's shaking his head. All right, SEC, like we said, 9-1 straight up last week, 3-7 against the spread. Just got 2 games here. Not a ton of movement on this one. Mississippi minus 6.5, but the computer has them by 6. So again, just straight up basically. But a lot of people are going to be betting on this game, Dan.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it's really 2 teams that do different things. I mean, Mississippi has turned into kind of a running team now that Matt Corral is no longer in Oxford, and Kentucky's more of a pass team. So This one should be pretty interesting. If I touch it at all, I'll probably take a few extra points on Kentucky because when the number is that close, you probably just want to take the points.
Yeah. Yeah. That's what I'm thinking. Would you tease Kentucky here?
Yeah,
Okay.
like I don't have a good enough reason to go against the computer there. So -6.5, and the computer has Kentucky +6. So yeah, I'd probably take a couple extra points, get it to like maybe minus Kentucky +9.5, +10 maybe,
Yep.
and see if I can pair that with somebody.
Yeah, for sure. Sounds good. Georgia -28. The computer has them by 37 over Missouri.
Yeah, I've already talked with my cousin who is a huge Georgia fan about this one. Full disclosure, I am a Missouri alum, but because of my journalism background and all the dealings I had with the Missouri Media Relations Department, I actually take some joy in seeing the Tigers screw up. So I'm all about watching Georgia make it nasty this week, and I think that after Georgia really, let's be fair, sleepwalked through that Kent State game,
Yeah,
I
man.
think Georgia comes out and just rules Missouri here. I mean, Missouri just doesn't have the horses to keep up with them, and they're facing Georgia's elite defense anyway, so this could get pretty ugly.
Yeah, for sure. All right, let's switch away from the Power Five conferences here. Dan, let's go see Conference USA. UTEP -2.5, but computer has them by 10 over Charlotte. Charlotte's a bad team, I think. I think they're real bad.
Yeah, Charlotte is pretty poor, and I mean the computer has been very low on Charlotte really from the beginning. Like Charlotte's rating is down at 4.02, so anytime you're getting into single digits or negative numbers, that's a really bad sign. They've already failed to win 2 games at home. The only game that they managed to win was over a Georgia State team that has really not shown up at all. I mean, Charlotte also managed to lose by 17 to William and Mary. So, yeah, I think the one thing that worries me is UTEP could be a little bit full of itself after whacking Boise State, but I don't know if Boise State's any good this year.
Yeah.
So that might help UTEP focus on this one. And yeah, I think the Miners should come out pretty comfortable in this game. I just don't think Charlotte's good at all.
Yeah, sounds good. Boise State, I know we're not talking about them, but Hank Bachmeier transferred. So just keep an eye out for that. Very interesting there, too. A little Mountain West transfer portal action. West Kentucky still in Conference USA here, Dan, -5.5, but computer has them by 15 over Troy.
Yeah, I'm hoping this isn't an overreaction on the computer's part because Western Kentucky won that game 73-0 last week over Florida International, and there's only so much that you can do there. I mean, it's still early enough in the season that can actually cause a pretty big jump. So, and granted, the computer knows Florida International is terrible. Florida International's rating is a -14. So that pretty much says all you need to know about the Golden Panthers. But I'm a little worried here because Troy has actually played pretty good football, and I think Western Kentucky might be a little bit overrated by the computer. I think they'll cover the 5.5, but the 15 that the computer is thinking here might be a stretch.
Sounds good. Go to the independent here. Obviously, UConn taking on Fresno State. Fresno State -23.5. The computer has them by 21. I thought this was an interesting game, Dan. So what do you like here?
Well, I mean, that's not an easy trip going across the country. I mean, Fresno to East Hartford is like 3,500 miles or something. Granted, the Big Ten thinks that makes complete sense, but I mean, I think that crossing 3 time zones and covering that many miles could make this tough on Fresno State. And UConn, while they're not a good team, they're at least playing with some kind of pride under Jim Mora. So I think there's a chance that Connecticut can actually keep this somewhat respectable. I mean, Fresno should win fairly easily, but that 21 points seems to be around where I think it should be.
Sounds good. Little action here. Central Michigan +7.5, but computer has them by 1 over Toledo, Dan.
Yeah, and that one could be very interesting because these 2 teams, along with Northern Illinois, this is probably the 3 teams that are going to decide who ends up winning the MAC West. And Central Michigan, they should have won the division last year. Like I was at the game covering Northern Illinois between the Huskies and the Chippewas in Mount Pleasant. Central Michigan should have won the game. It was a 39-38 win for Northern Illinois. Central Michigan gets a kick to try and win it. Ball slides right through the holder's hands. Northern Illinois falls on it. Game over. So Central Michigan won this game last year against Toledo in overtime, and they return a good chunk of their offensive weapons from that game, and they've played two really good opponents in Oklahoma State and Penn State. So I don't think they're going to be afraid of this trip, and I think there's a real chance they can pull this off.
All right. Love to hear it. All right, Dan. Well, we didn't do too well with our one play last week. Obviously, you had Penn State. Is that right, if I remember correctly?
Yeah, Penn State just let their foot off the gas a little too soon.
Yep. And then I had ECU, and they look not great at all. They were minus 16.5. And, for a long time, that was a very close matchup for most of the game. So,
yeah. And then Navy actually won it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So not a great start for us for our plays here. But like we said in episode 1, we're going to pick one game, and whoever has a better record at the end of the year will kind of be the champion. So Dan, we'll let you start first. We have no winner from week 1. We're both tied, but we'll let you go first here.
It's a long season.
Yeah, it is.
So I think I'm going to go with Army minus the 7.5 here. Computer likes the Knights by 16 against Georgia State. And Georgia State has really been a mess this season. I mean, their first game against South Carolina, okay, they actually played somewhat decently until the special teams just killed them. But since that game, I mean, this is a team that managed to lose to Charlotte. And we've already talked about how poor the 49ers are. So I really think that Georgia State going on the road here, the defense is really weak, 88th against the run, which is kind of a death sentence against Army. So, yeah, I think the Black Knights will just triple option them to death here.
All right. I love it. Sounds good, Dan. I am going to fade my upset of the week pick last week, Louisiana Monroe, and I'm going to take Arkansas State here minus 7.5. Obviously, I think that was probably their best win. Obviously, Louisiana Monroe last week, one they'll hang their hats on throughout the season. They'll look back and be like, yeah, that was a great game. But overall, I still think Louisiana Monroe is not that great of a team, especially on the road. I think they're averaging 10 points per game on the road, so that's not great. Arkansas State should have enough offense to get by this team. So I think minus 7.5, whatever you get it at. I like that number.
I really like that as well. And I think Louisiana Monroe, beating a rival and doing it for the first time in 11 years.
Yeah.
I think they're still gonna be thinking about Lafayette at kickoff, and they're probably not gonna be ready to play this game. So I really love that pick.
Yeah, for sure. Arkansas State, good defense or good passing game, I should say, and Louisiana Monroe struggles against the pass, struggles mightily. Yep. So, all right, there we go. Well, Dan, we're both gonna get our first win of the season. I can feel it.
Let's hope so.
Sounds good. Again, you can follow us on Twitter. That's DanAngel11. I'm Cody Capper Pace, www.codasportscappers.com. Dan releases his ratings every single week. So be sure to follow him on Twitter and check that out on the website at Coda Cappers, Dan. And we'll see you for week 3.
Peace.